right. So today we have Dieter Matzi on, currently a senior cloud governance engineer at Roku. Dieter, you and I actually go back quite a bit. We both share
for many years.
Yes, many years. We both share the German heritage. The irony is, I think, probably couldn't have this conversation in German, right? Because it's like so technical and so specific. Yes. So today we want to talk about cloud financial management, which is a practice that you've seen evolve, and I would also say shape over the last few years at different companies. And today I would say let's dive right in. And cloud financial management. I remember last year, Martin Casado from A16 wrote this paper and this podcast around cloud costs, and it was Dropbox repatriating. And so all of a sudden we have a lot of attention to this topic, new startups, new tooling. What is your perspective on this? Like, how come, why now? How have things evolved? Like, walk us down memory lane a little bit, maybe.
I think, not much has changed really, right? There's a wider cloud adoption, right? The people that are in cloud, they are recognizing that you don't go into the cloud for cost savings, you go for velocity of innovation. And the people that want to go into the cloud, they recognize the same thing for the most part, right? Now the tooling has improved over the last 10 years, right? The tools that we had, 10 years ago are, expanded functionality, and also the knowledge around those tools, right? You can now find blog posts that have Athena queries for specific use cases, how to pull RIA utilization out of Athena directly. And that knowledge base simply didn't exist 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. I want to, like, some of the listeners here may not be really deep in the tech. Athena is an AWS product. It's a query engine, right? It allows you to write queries. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I mean, you've done this being cloud financial management at Intuit, at Netflix, now at Roku. How has awareness changed? I'm totally with you that you go into the cloud for agility, flexibility, and speed. How has awareness of the cost topic changed, though? Any changes lately? Have you observed anything?
I think there is, specifically with executives, right? If I compare executives 10 years ago versus now, when we brought up cloud cost as an item to optimize, right? Another dimension that engineers need to look at when they look at efficiency and performance. It was not at the forefront of leadership's thinking, right? Well, nowadays, even companies that are relatively new to the cloud, leadership has an understanding of the concept of having to pay attention to cost, right? And that trickles down the hierarchy, right? Sometimes, I don't want to say it happens every week, but it happens, regularly, that I'm talking to an engineer, and the engineer the engineers have their own things to do, right? They have their own roadmaps, their own deliverables. They need features. They need, customer satisfaction, customer delight. They need all those kind of things, right? And when I come with like cloud cost, I'm sort of like at the bottom of the list, right? And that's normal. And I enjoy that actually. However, when I escalate to management or to leadership, the immediate feedback is, yes, this is something that we are going to take a look at, right? They may have to prioritize it. It may not be like an urgent need at this very moment, but at least there is no more buy-in from leadership that cost is something that we actively need to look at and manage.
Yeah. Do you what differences do you see in terms of leadership, like CFO versus CEO? And do you see what differences do you see across different industry verticals? Like, I'm making this up, but is banking more advanced than retail or other way around? What differences do you see?
I think it really depends. Each company has their own culture. And within that company, there's different business units that, again, have a slightly different interpretation of that company culture, right? So you need to adapt. As a cloud financial management professional, you need to adapt to those different viewpoints, right, and cater to them. However, when we look at what a CEO, CTO, or CFO is interested in, I think unanimously the CFO is interested in being able to predict cloud spend 2, 3, 4 years out into the future, right? Because ultimately, I think what the CFO takes a look at is there's sort of like the pie chart of the entire revenue of a company. Usually around half of it is headcount, and then some significant portion is unfortunately still physical office spaces, right? Mm-hmm. Hopefully this will become less of a cost item moving into the future. And then there is sort of like a relatively small slice left, that is innovation related, right? It can be new projects, new features, new hardware, as it is with Roku, right? Now you can talk to your Roku remote control. You can say like, hey, show me Netflix or show me HBO, and the system will understand that, and you will see the result on the screen. Those kind of projects sort of share funding with the cloud on a very high level. Typically, while they are compartmentalized, right, so the cloud cannot necessarily escape its budget. If there is a budget overrun, the money has to come from somewhere, right? And we can't take it from headcount. That is not flexible. It's not a very easily accessible thing. We can't take it from the offices and things like sales, marketing, physical security, cafeteria, landscaping, those kind of things, right? It's really hard to adjust those cost items. So it has to come from somewhere. So some projects that were already in flight have to be put on hold, or projects that if you are over forecasting, right, and you have budget left over, you could have started projects with that budget that would have pushed your company forward in innovation, right? And the innovation is really the critical distinguishing factor, because your competitors are doing the same thing. So I think everyone is very well aware that whatever your engineers, if you can scan a receipt and put it into your tax form, right, automatically fill in your 1040 easy or something like that. That is extremely powerful technology, and if your competitors have it and you don't have it, right, that's a checkbox on a long list of features that you're not capable of providing. Vice versa, if you have it and your competitors don't have it, people are more inclined that need this feature to go to you.
I painfully feel that example this very moment as we're looking at different finance tools. It's very vivid. You're absolutely right. Yeah. I want to. So this aspect of trade-off and innovation versus cost savings. The actual. I'm going to position it as a trade-off, and I've seen VP of engineers have a conversation where they said, I can only give you one of two. I either give you efficiency and cost savings, or I give you new features, but I can't give you both. Like, you need to pick one, right? Or we sort of we do 1 quarter of sprints only on cost efficiency and 1 quarter of sprints only on innovation, but I can't give you both. How do you, what's your take on that perceived trade-off? Does it exist? Why can't I have both? Is that possible?
I mean, you can have both to some extent, right? I think that black and white view is some traditional mindset, some traditional thinking, right? Remember, a lot of the engineers, for example, at Intuit that are now working in the cloud, they have been supporting TurboTax or QuickBooks for 10, 20 years, right? Intuit has been around for 35 years. So those engineers basically started after college, and they have now families on their own, right? And so they try to compartmentalize, right? But certainly within cloud financial management, our goal is always to achieve both, right? You can have your innovation, but you have to estimate it before you get started, right? We need to know how this bubble will look like that you are creating. Is it 50,000 cores? Is it 100,000 cores? What does this look like, and for how long, right? And one thing that I noticed that engineers, if an experiment is successful, they will dismantle it immediately. I mean, unsuccessful, they will dismantle it immediately. If the experiment is successful, they will keep it around for weeks to show off to their friends, and it costs money 24/7, right? So the idea here is to combine, to merge innovation with cost consciousness. And the way to do that is to present the cost vector, the cost dimension, as another optimization requirement to the engineering and the engineering leaders.
Mm-hmm. What's the narrative and what is the change in mindset that you're trying to infuse into these leaders? When you have these, I mean, look, when did you join Roku? I think last year.
Yeah, a year and a half ago, about.
Year and a half ago, right? And I'm sure, like, you know, I mean, you're the new guy, you come in, right? And now you have to create trust with the team, right? Like, you have to, like, talk to me about that. Like, what is your approach? Because I assume, I mean, Roku hired you for a reason, right? But you can't just walk in and flip the company on its head, right? You need to start somewhere, right? Like, how do you typically go about that? And what's your approach?
Yeah, I mean, it is making people aware, right? There's a training component to that, right? A knowledge sharing component where, you know, you just need to be very mindful and gentle and explain to people how things work, right? Because they might not know. They may have best intentions. Really, honestly, you know, I've been working since '92, right? So in 30 years, you know, it has not happened once that I found an evil person, you know?
Yeah.
So they generally, everyone tries to do their best, but there may be other challenges, right? There may be challenges within the business, or there may be challenges, you know, on the private life side, right, that they need to be dealing with. And just being open, honest, right? Never make something up. Whatever I do, I back it up with data, or I explain it, or I tell them, you know, in my experience, having done that multiple times before, this is the potential outcomes that I'm seeing, right? And just being open and really not having any secrets or trying to influence people with, you know, just making unverified statements, right? Try not even avoid that. It's just not an option, right? You need to be pragmatic about it, data-driven, and explain to people, you know, what it is that they can do and how you can help them. This is how you build collaboration.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned the term data-driven. Can you talk a little bit about the data sources? Where do you go for your data, for your cost data? How do you split it up? Like, what tooling do you use, and what data sources do those tools use? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. I will use anything that is available, anything that I can get my hands on. So, you know, if you're on Amazon Web Services, more often than not, you're using Cost Explorer, right? Or maybe some Athena query. If the subject matter is a little bit more complex, you may have to pull the data into a spreadsheet and then visualize it in that spreadsheet. You know, even having a graph is not necessarily guaranteed that the people that look at the graph will understand it, right? So sharing these kind of insights before a meeting and then discussing them in a meeting and going through the data first to make sure that everyone understands the data, that is the recipe for success, right? For the most part, the way I categorize things is either monthly savings potential or annual savings potential, right? You know, if the monthly savings potential is only $500, maybe that is not as exciting, right? Because an engineer may have to spend 4 or 5 hours, which may already exceed that amount. In that case, then I would position it as a, you know, $6,000 annual saving, right? Just to make a reference point that people can understand, right? Mm-hmm. At the same time, if we are looking at, let's say, logging characteristics, they're typically in the billions or trillions of metrics. And it's difficult for people to wrap their head around those large numbers, right? People are just not used to that. So, you know, the way to do that is to display the data in millions, right? And then you get something like, you know, a million number, and that is something that people can understand. You just need to downsample it. But again, you know, you have an action that you're requesting or that is needed, and you back it up with, here's the potential savings, here's the damage to the company, and put it into context.
And that data comes from, like in the case of AWS, you mentioned the AWS Cost Explorer, and then I guess is it the cost and usage report? Is that sort of the
Sure.
yeah? And maybe for people who haven't looked or are not familiar with the cost and usage report, can you give us a flavor of what that thing looks like and how AWS delivers it?
So for the most part, unless you have special pricing or there is a huge volume that your company is driving, for the most part, it arrives 3 times a day, roughly spaced 8 hours apart. And while you do receive the data, some of the data points may be trailing in that file. So they are still missing. They are going to be backfilled over time. And this is specifically the case at month end when Amazon Web Services is processing all the bills for all the customers, right? And they have millions of customers. So you may see like 2-3 day lag, even though you just received an updated version of the Cur, you may see like a lag in there. So you just need to be aware of that. And yeah, the Cur itself, depending on how you're receiving it, you could receive it as a comma-separated value file, which is typically not the normal way of doing it. You would usually receive it in Parquet format, and there's a manifest there, and the manifest shows you where all the different chunks are of that file, and there could be hundreds of thousands of pieces that need to be sort of stitched together. So it's not just a spreadsheet that you can open up on your computer. You need tools to be able to view this data.
Got it. And sorry, my camera just went off. Here we go. Should work again.
Seems to be coming back.
Should work now. Here we are.
Right.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, because I'm still familiar with your work that you did at Intuit, where you built an in-house solution for your cost analytics, right? And you built it on AWS tooling, you put it into a data warehouse, Amazon Redshift, and you crunched, I think, billions of rows of cost and usage report data, right? Interesting. And now, do you see any other data sources these days that some of the tool vendors?
Kubernetes is definitely a new data source that we need to take a look at, right? The Kubernetes control plane, or old school people will call it the master, has data with requested resources and how much of that requested resource was actually utilized. So that is new data, and the allocation model has to be extended into containerized services, right? So on containers, you can either use namespaces or labels. Tags are called labels in the container world, right? So you can either use namespaces to allocate your cost, or you can use labels to allocate your cost. And then again, an engineer may request a container that is 2 gigabytes in size, and they only use 50 megs of that, right, memory. So you need to, again, surface the waste telemetry within the container environment.
Interesting. So the shift to Kubernetes and cloud native architectures in general is changing the ways some of the reporting tools have to work, correct? Right? Interesting. Yeah. And okay. So then, and does that mean also, you mentioned how in the case of the Cur, AWS sends you a new version roughly every 8 hours. Does that mean tooling is always 8 hours behind, or do we even need real time? Can you talk a little bit about the freshness of data and how relevant it is?
Yeah, I mean, the freshness of data is a little bit of an issue depending on what your business needs are. So for example, if an engineer launches a workload and then goes into Cost Explorer that same hour, they won't even be able to see the workload, right? That's just a reality. They may have to wait a day to be able to see what the handiwork that they accomplished, right? The Cur itself is, for the most part, it works well. There is a way to actually query the AWS API and get the data from the car before the car actually arrives. So within that 8-hour time period, assuming that the data is available through the API, you can actually query the API. There's a small cost associated to that, right? But it can be done with a simple script, like maybe 50 lines of code or something like that. You can get that, pull that information from AWS. But again, it doesn't help you if AWS has 175 services, and each service has its own billing structures or artifacts, right, that it sends into the customer bill. And that pipeline may take some time, right? Some services also report billing data at different times. So for example, the simple storage service, usually you see on the first day of the month a spike indicating the costs of some of its SKUs or stock keeping units, while other services like EC2 sort of report in an hourly cost that you can then graph.
Interesting. And you mentioned the 175 services. A typical bill, how have you seen things shift in terms of, is 80% of the bill compute, different EC2 instances, and 20% is something else? Or and has that evolved in any way from like compared to 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and today? Is it like, hey, I'm still spending, I don't know, I'm making this up, like 100K a month, but now I have 100 services, and versus 5 years ago I only had 10 services. Has that evolved in any way?
It has evolved a little bit. There's a couple. So first, each company will have their own mix of services, cloud services that they are using, right? Companies like Netflix or Roku that have streaming media will have a larger storage percentage, right? That's just how it is. All this media is going to be petabytes of data, and that component will be slightly larger. For the most part, the differentiation between compute and storage, those will be the major items on your bill, right? Now, how this shifts from maybe an EC2 to a container service or to a serverless function, I do see a shift over time, right? While builds maybe 10 years ago had, as you said, 20 line items, because there's things like CloudTrail, CloudWatch that were always SNS, SQS, right? That were always present. Now I see a higher diversity of line items, right? For example, out of the 175 services, your company may be using 90 services nowadays, right? And overall, I also see a little bit of a trend to go into more of the modern services, right? More of the cloud native services, the serverless services. In addition to seeing a trend becoming a little bit multi-cloud, right? Because maybe some other cloud provider may have some products that they are offering for analytics and data that are easier to use or have better features than other cloud providers.
Interesting. So there's almost like a fragmentation of the cloud bill going on, right?
Yes.
Driven by multiple services by the providers, and then the multi-cloud aspect that you just mentioned. Interesting, yeah. And so we've talked about, so far we've covered the analytics side a lot, right? It's like getting intelligence into what's running, where the savings are. Can we talk a little bit about the actual remedy process? Where do you start? And I feel like, tell me if this is wrong, but I feel like there are 3 dimensions. Number one, the individual resources where engineering can make adjustments. Number 2 is reserved instances, so long-term provisioning of resources and commitments. And the third one are EDPs, right? Enterprise discount programs. I don't know if that's the right way of looking at things, but that's sort of in my mind how I think about the world. Is that?
That's a good first start. I would even simplify it in FinOps. We are looking at rate reduction and cost avoidance. Those are the 2 tools that we have available. So it's really simple, right? You only have two tools, a hammer and a wrench. That's it. Now, on the rate reduction side, there is enterprise discounts, of course. There's also private pricing agreements, right? Often not being talked about. So, for example, on the GCP side, GCP is offering 60,000 different stock keeping units where you can obtain private pricing agreements. Very powerful, right? On the AWS side, I think GCP is sort of a little bit newer, so they thought this through a little bit more, and their services are more structured to that kind of usage, right? And then on the rate reduction side, we also have reservations on the Azure side. We have the SUDs and CUDs, so sustained usage discounts and committed usage discounts on the GCP side. And we have compute savings plans, EC2 instance savings plans, SageMaker savings plans, and the different types of reserved instances on the AWS side with regional, convertible, and combinations thereof, and standard, of course, as well.
I just created that matrix in my head. It gets complex pretty fast.
Yes, there is. The last time I looked at that was in 2020, I believe. Just for EC2, AWS had over 4 million stock keeping units.
Unbelievable.
So that doesn't fit on a spreadsheet anymore, right? And then on the cost reduction side, we have the usual things of, cloud parking. Turning things off either on a schedule or via switch. Like, think of your conference room, right? I mean, we haven't been in conference rooms for quite a while now, but the reality is that there's a power sensor, like a light sensor thing, and when no one is in the conference room, it turns the lights off automatically, right? So building something of that nature, then the typical right sizing, right? You're using less than 10% of your compute and memory that you requested, right? And then also maybe re-architecting, right? Going to more cloud native services that could be cheaper.
Interesting. Yeah. And so these can we talk a little bit about these EDP negotiations?
Sure.
I feel like they're almost like black art. There's a little bit like nobody knows how they work. It would be, yeah. What's your viewpoint? Yeah.
No, and I mean, many times when there are conversations, right? Let's say at the FinOps Foundation, they have a conference or something like that, right? What we absolutely want to avoid is that the customer publicly, maybe on a recording, states their discount, right? Is it 10%? Is it 5% or whatnot, right? That is something that is typically under non-disclosure agreement, right? However, talking about EDPs, I think is becoming more and more common case, right? Maybe 10 years ago, even the vendor would ask you not to talk about your EDP, but nowadays the vendors are welcoming that, right? Because customers that have high volume, the vendor is looking forward to giving discounts and offering more services, right? Ultimately, it is a revenue increase on the vendor side, right? So when we are looking at EDPs, honestly, I've seen EDPs that have there can be anything in it, right? Including things of like person XYZ has to show up at conference ABC. And give a speech, right? I have seen that in EDP. But typically what you will see in EDP is that you have a discount that is sort of like a cross-service discount, right? So maybe you get 10%. And by the way, 10% is a fictional number because the EDP discounts are typically higher, right? 10% is a default discount that you would receive. So I'm just using it as an example. So let's say you get 10% discount across all services, right? Then I have seen some of the private pricing agreements actually rolled into EDPs where you say like, okay, for simple storage service, you get a slightly different discount, maybe 12% or something like that, right? And in addition, there is different types of credits that can be offered, right? For example, commonly people understand a migration credit, right? You're currently in the data center, you're moving into the cloud, there is sort of like an overhead of running two workloads in parallel, one in the data center and one in the cloud. One will end at some point and one will start, and so there you have some overlap, right? With that overlap, that can be quantified in a dollar value, and the cloud vendor will just give you a migration credit, because for the most part, these cloud vendors are very large corporations, right? Giving one-time credits, which is basically a discount of their services, right, is much easier for them to do than to give you a discount percentage that applies to all services, because that discount percentage will never go down, right? You will only move up from that, right?
Yeah.
In addition to having these migration credits, you can also look for training credits, implementation credits. So training is, my engineers don't know nothing about cloud, right? Can you give us some free courses? Any facility that offers training courses, right, has sort of like a budget for a couple of free tickets, right? So you can roll that in there. Typically, to get your engineers, up to speed and be able to use the cloud services efficiently. Because I have seen over the time, right, that if you don't have the knowledge, you start using cloud as like you think it would work, but it doesn't really work like that in reality, right?
Yeah.
So you have training credits, you have implementation credits. Implementation credits are typically professional services, where someone would just, the cloud provider sends a couple of engineers over to your office, right? And these engineers are boots on ground working with your engineers to move those cloud workloads over. Last not least, acceleration credits, my favorite. Typically, there's two thresholds, right? Let's say you have a 20 million threshold. So your enterprise agreement, when it is negotiated, is typically for a specific time duration for a specific amount. Let's say you're agreeing to 50 million over 5 years, right? So that is what we are looking at. However, if you manage to grow faster in the cloud, let's say to 60 million, maybe the cloud vendor gives you $1 million back, right? And if you manage to grow to 70 million within that duration, the cloud vendor gives you, $2 million back, something like that, right? Those are acceleration credits. So there's a lot of different tools that we have when we look at those EDPs.
Interesting. And who on the customer side negotiates these EDPs? Who has a seat at the table, and how's that different depending on the size of the company?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a small company, it will be the CEO, right? There's no one else around. But if it's a larger company, it will usually be a cross-functional team, right? You will have a CTO or a COO, someone like that, right? Depending on what the CEO does. If operations means physical buildings, then that person is maybe less interested in cloud, right? However, and definitely the CFO will be there too, right? Because the CFO needs to figure out how to represent this, put this on the books and represent it to the public, assuming you're a publicly traded company, right? And typically there will be also some people, like I'm usually in those conversations, right? Because I have a lot of knowledge, right? If someone has never negotiated an EDP and the cloud vendor comes with some suggestion, at the minimum, they will want to ask someone, do you think this is fair? Does this look good, right? And then I can say yes or no, right, at the minimum. And, typically there will be also some engineers that have more detailed or deeper cloud knowledge, right, that can give a substantiated answer of, is that a growth that we actually can realistically achieve? Or is the cloud vendor exaggerating the growth projections?
So forecasting becomes an important capability.
Absolutely,
right.
It's critical. So one thing that we haven't talked about is at Roku, I built a driver-based forecasting system that has an average monthly variance of 2%, which is unheard of.
That's small. That's crazy small.
Yes, industry typically has 10 to 15%. That's a good variance, right?
Yeah.
And at Intuit, we built a machine learning system that had a 5 to 9% variance compared to when people were doing the forecast, right? The forecast could vary somewhere between like 20 and 70% by business unit, right? So, and the driver-based forecasting system in December had a 1% variance, which is our busiest month.
Yeah.
Right? So it works extremely well, and we leverages that forecasting system for all kinds of users, not just for the EDP. For example, if we have a contract with a renewal coming up with a logging vendor like a New Relic or a Datadog, someone like that, right? We need to be able to project our growth of the services that are causing the logs, and we leverage the forecasting system again to make projections of how much commitment we can do with on these contracts, because a commitment is always a time duration and a dollar amount. If you exceed the dollar amount, you might get acceleration credits or just nothing, right? If you are below the committed dollar amount, the remainder is required as a check to the vendor at the end of the duration.
It's use it or lose it, right? Like
yes.
you committed to it, right? Yeah. So then your forecasting model is very interesting now. And it's I assume this is some sort of model. I mean, talk to us about talk to me about the data you're crunching there. What is it? That's very interesting, because I know a lot of people are trying to figure that one out and they struggle with it. And
I mean, driver-based forecasting is not easy, right? Most people will do trend-based forecasting, or which uses exponential smoothing, something like Hall's-Winters triple exponential smoothing that has seasonality and trending and level in it, right? But again, this is a little bit more of a guesswork. What we do at Roku is the business is already forecasting. Roku has actually different groups that do different types of forecasts. There's actually groups that do like 10, 20, 30-year forecasts for what buildings we need in which countries of what size, right? And so that is something that is. I'm really happy about that, right? It's really at the forefront of everyone's thinking. And there are different business units that will forecast key performance indicators, right? Key performance indicators are things like streaming hours, active accounts, ad revenue, those kind of things, right? And they will forecast it for 4 years or 48 months out, right? The forecast gets updated, let's say, every month, right? So we get the forecast is actually versioned of those KPIs, right? So you have version 1, 2, 3. Depending on what month you are in. And then to do a driver-based forecast, once you have the KPI forecast, it's actually relatively simple. You need to find tags that are in the cloud environment and map those tags to the drivers. So for example, let's say a mobile front end might scale with streaming hours, while a user database might grow with active accounts. Right? So you categorize basically your workloads and assign KPIs to them, and then you use actuals and you grow those actuals using the growth of the KPIs. It's a very simple calculation.
I was going to say, it doesn't sound like there's complex machine learning or AI involved. It's really only common sense and tagging.
Yes. Yeah. Correct.
Interesting. Okay, so forecast, we covered the analytics side, the remediation, the FinOps part, the forecasting. Before this talk, we chatted about actual cloud adoption, and you mentioned one metric that today I think like still 95% of all workloads are still in a traditional legacy data center, and only 5% is in the cloud. Yeah, right. So that means things are shifting. Right. Yep. For those. And what is your advice for a company that starts that journey? And maybe both for, let's say, a Fortune 500 company, and then also I see startups that raised their Series A, 20, 30 employees, they ramp up to 120. And I see they all make the same mistakes all over again. What is your advice for these companies when they go about this cloud native journey and cloud financial management?
Yeah, I mean, one insight that I would share early on is that every company needs to become a technology company in addition to what their regular business is about, right? Think of like a Nike, right? They have sportswear, but they need to become a technology company. Let's say Nationwide Insurance, right? They do insurance policies and those kind of things, but they need to become a technology company. Let's look at Walmart, right? Walmart shifted into cloud, started 10 years ago and is heavily in the cloud and is a technology company, right? In addition to your core business, you need to become a technology company, right? That is, I think, something that people need to understand. This is what modernization or digital transformation means, right? You have whatever business you're doing, you're going to keep doing that, but you need to build that digital side of your business, right? Make it available to customers, so that on your phone you can pay your Starbucks coffee, right? Whatever, right? And that is what your goal is, and why is that? Well, it's again for the velocity of innovation, right? Yes, you can build all the kind of products that you want, but if you don't have anyone to buy those products, it won't make a difference, right? Doing the digital transformation now opens your business up to a much wider audience, right? You may see a 10x growth, and on your journey to that digital transformation, I've seen businesses elect to have 18-month transition time windows or 3-year transition time windows. I highly would encourage anyone to try to do it much faster, right? When we looked at moving Turbotax into the cloud, and Turbotax has been around since 35 years, it is running C code, not C++, not C#, but there are some components that are running C code, right? Again, these engineers are now, maybe grandparents, right? And they have been successful for an extremely long time period, right? The first time we looked at that, the proposal was a 3-year migration plan, right? Then we asked the person in charge to condense it, and they condensed it to an 18-month migration plan, right? Then the person eventually left the company, and we did it in 3 months, right? And again, 3 months is even that is a little bit extensive, but what people need to understand is Turbotax is not just one application. It is about 60, and there's components in it like the login, right? Where you put in your account name and your password, your username, and that login is actually shared across other Intuit applications. Like QuickBooks uses the exact same code. It's just that in QuickBooks, it looks green because it's co-branded, right?
Yeah.
So we needed to actually move that service over first to the cloud before we could move Turbotax, because no one would be able to log into Turbotax, right?
Yeah.
So there are some dependencies here, right? And 3 months is a really good result, right? I don't think we could have done it faster than that, but it's also amazing to see it's a mindset change, right? To go from 3 years to 3 months, it's mostly a mindset change. And don't be afraid. So many times I talk to people that have overly long migration plans, right? It's going to be a slightly painful period, that migration. Rather than pulling that Band-Aid off extremely slowly, right? Just try to do it as quickly as possible. And don't be afraid. Things will work in the cloud. Things will be great in the cloud. And in the cloud, you have many more options than you have in the data center, right? You can go larger. You can go smaller. And these options just simply don't exist, and maybe engineers don't think of them because they didn't exist before.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. And I think for Turbotax, I think the interesting aspect there is that I think 80% of your traffic, or if their traffic, happens the 2 days before tax day, right? So yeah.
That is correct. We actually ended up building something in the cloud that was not possible in the data center before, right? And Turbotax is actually truly active in 2 regions. And it is Ohio and Oregon, right? Because North Virginia, as everyone knows, is the region that has the most technical difficulties on the Amazon Web Services side, right? And so Turbotax is 50% active in both regions, Ohio and Oregon, right? And we actually do, every Monday, we do a load test using test data, fake data, against the production cluster, right? And we ramp it up to like a tax day level, just to see how the different systems will behave, right? Because you have message queues, the message queues have dead letter queues, right? The dead letter queues can fill up and will drop dead letters. So there's all these kinds of technical intricacies that you need to be aware of and learn over and over and over, right? So if you do that 52 times a year, right? You simulate tax day. On tax day, no one got paged. No one was even worried, right? The engineers had a normal day for the very first time after going into the cloud, right? Tax day was an all hands on deck, people in a war room and food being brought in. Right? So that event completely disappeared with the modernization.
Interesting. So rather than preparing everything for the one big event and then you sit in the room and fingers crossed, right? You do it every week, right? You stress test the system. Yeah. So and you can do that with the cloud, right?
You can do that with the cloud, right?
Yeah. Okay. For smaller companies, let's say the startup world, I mean, they're going to be cloud native anyhow. And I just know it from board meetings where it's not a problem, or cost, it's not a problem, it is a huge problem. Like, we need to change this right now, right? And
that's right. Yes.
What's your advice for them when they start out, even when they're 10 people or 20 people?
You know, the problem is that cloud is still not being taught at universities in that detail that is required, right? When the AWS approached me about how can we increase Spot usage, I suggested to give it away for free to universities, right? So, not everyone can get it for free, right? Because then we will have, web servers with inappropriate content very quickly all over the place, right? That AWS is now hosting. But if you can give it away for free to universities and start training, right? The people that are going to be future employees, right? For small companies, start early with a governance program, with a best practices, with cloud formation templates, right? With Confluence pages explaining on how to do things, right? Putting guardrails in place, right? There are some tools that are, third party and not cheap, right? But maybe you can find, there's like, for example, Turbot is a very complex system that is based on cloud custodian code in part, has 7,000 rules that you can set up, right? But that also requires that the person that is using this tool knows what they are doing, right? If they haven't used really cloud before, then this tool is of no use to them. But there are open source alternatives to this, right? But you do need someone that has the knowledge to configure that tool correctly, right, to help you. What we see very often is orphaned elastic block store volumes. So the virtual drives that are attached to compute, right? There's a slew of things that are happening, load balancers that cost money, but there is no EC2 or no compute attached to it, right? Elastic Internet Protocol IP addresses, right? that would be free if there were a compute instance, but they start costing money if you just have them sitting without compute attached to them, right?
Yeah.
There's a slew of those things that engineers can do wrong, right? I would say maybe one of the easiest ways for a startup to ensure their engineers, the knowledge level is high, is to insist on certifications, right? It is a painful, again, it's a Band-Aid that needs to be pulled, right? It is painful. There's a cost associated to it, right? That is not cheap. It's several $1,000s, not tens of thousands, but it's not nothing, right? It's not something that I can just open my wallet and put a couple of 20s on the table. But insist on certifications, right? To get a minimum of knowledge within your engineering body.
Yeah, I see those little certifications pop up. There's a whole startup ecosystem around that makes it. It's almost like an NFT. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but it's easy to create a graph, but or that visual for the certification, but to make it authentic, I think Credly is one of them. Interesting.
Oh no, I'm being asked almost every month, right? If I want to do some courses on some website that I have never heard of, right?
Yeah. Okay, so really the key success components: training. Right? Like train your people from the beginning, educate them about the usage of cloud. I think a function of that would be the certificates that you just mentioned, like make sure they're certified so they actually know what they're doing, your people, right? The third one is governance, I guess, where do you see
automation maybe even, right?
I'm sorry?
Some kind of governance automation maybe even, right?
Governance
automation. Have something in place, some CloudFormation templates, some templatization. Think of paved road, right? Provide some guidance to your engineers on how to build their workloads in the cloud.
Right. Okay, so governance, and then where do you see guardrails? Is that a standalone?
No, that's sort of like the automated governance, right? Let's say someone starts an EC2 instance that is $24 an hour. Usually they are less than in the cent range, right? That you turn this off and send them an email saying like, hey, did you know that this was $24 an hour? Right?
Got it.
That is the guardrail.
That's the guardrail. Okay. Dieter, this was plenty of information in 1 hour. Thank you so much. Unless I forgot anything, any other parting thoughts?
Great. If you want to do it again, feel free to reach out. I enjoyed it a lot.
So did I. Thank you. We will. I think we should do this at least once a year, but I want to say like twice a year because things evolve so much and what changes. Dieter, thank you so much here. And we look forward to hearing from you again in a few months.
Of course. Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.